Hello, everyone, once again. Thank you for joining the first Simplenova session in this 2023 season in the first quarter. It took some time to prepare all the information, but here we are. I'm glad to see that more and more of you are joining the session. My name is Domas. I'm responsible for sales at Simplenova, and here together I'm with my colleague Simonas, who will be the main presenter. He prepared all the information for today's session about utilizing the main SharePoint connector to handle file management in Dynamics 365 Business Central. Before we'll start the session, I would like to mention that we are going to have, if you'll have any questions during the session, but by the end of it, we will have time for questions and answers. Use Q&A for that instead of chat. Of course, if you'll write something in the chat, we'll answer as well, but we would suggest to use the Q&A part in Zoom. And before we'll start everything, let me introduce a little bit Simplenova, who we are and what we do, for those who haven't worked with us before or haven't heard at all. So we started our operations back in 2013, and the main goal was to help for Microsoft partners to move their clients to the newer versions. So at that time, it was the conversions from the classic versions to RTC. And we noticed that it requires quite a lot of manual work for some of the repetitive tasks. So Simplenova decided that we need to build some tools that would help us to eliminate some manual work and make those processes more efficient. Simonas, to the first slide still, thanks. And that's how we started creating tools for upgrades, such as report converter, data port converter. Right now, we just recently launched back in 2022, I believe in June, Simplenova's AL tool, which about which I'm going to talk a little bit later. And of course, with the tools, at the same time, we are building an expert team in upgrade fields. So currently we do have 4 upgrade teams who are specializing in this field. So they know all the shortcuts, all the best practices. And well, actually, this is one of the reasons why Simonas is going to present this session. This is once again gained from our experience while working on the upgrade project and so on. So at the same time, we are helping partners with the development resources. If partners are working, let's say, while implementing new features or functionalities after the upgrades, we can help you with these kind of things as well. Or in general, if you are doing like a new implementation, we can help you with the experienced developers from our side. Or if you do need some help with the consultancy from the consultants, we can help you in this field as well. So as I've mentioned, we have launched various tools that we are using actually internally for because we are roughly doing 50 to 60 upgrades a year. So in total, we have delivered more than 450 upgrade projects. And for all of them, we are using our automated tools. And right now, I would like to share a little bit more about our recently launched tool, which is Simplenova's AL tool, or you can call it SALT. So what is the main idea of the tool itself? So SALT automatically applies many of the fixes you would do normally. Let's say if you are converting your solution from CL to AL with TXT to AL tool, you would get most probably a bunch of errors. So Salt automatically applies many of the fixes you would normally search for and apply manually, provides suggestions, implements useful developer functions, and gives you guidance throughout your project using cutting-edge chatbot solution as well. So the thing is, right here you can see the main parts which Salt automatically handles. One of them is Temblob usage. Temblob usage is refactored into using the dedicated Temblob code unit together with all functions which are used to manipulate data inside Temblob records. What I would say one of the biggest advantages while using Salt would be part related to events. It moves custom code to events. So event commands are extracted from code unit delta files. All events are moved from AL files to dedicated event subscription code units divided by object type. And of course, where possible, code modifications are moved to the closest available events. Tool itself also handles breaking changes, part of the objects and methods which have been split up, refactored, or renamed by Microsoft are automatically updated and fixed accordingly. So it means that we are, preparing the tool basically for all upcoming, for all the new Microsoft releases. Another one great thing is that Salt handles option conversion to enums automatically, and it helps to deal with file management issues. So, for example, whenever a deprecated function from the file management code unit is used, it is refactored to work in AL, including usage of blob import instead of directly working with the files in the original way. As we are using this tool internally, according our estimations, it saves around 30% of the whole time per project if we are talking about really, heavily customized conversions from CL to AL. And it already saved more than 1,000 hours for Simplenova team while dealing with upgrade projects. So at this moment, the tool is already available for all partners. So if you will have any questions regarding the tool itself, we can, I'll try to answer all the questions within the end of the session. And there is a possibility to have the trial license as well. So it means that you can already apply this tool for your ongoing upgrade project. So if you will have any questions during the session, just let me know. Or if you would like to get more details regarding Salt, just contact sales@simplenova.com and we'll get in touch with you as soon as possible. And within the end of the session, you'll see all the contacts, how you can do that. So that would be it from my side, Simonas. So I'll give a word for you to go through the main topic of the day.
Thanks, Domas. So greetings everyone attending. My name is Simonas and I'm one of the developers here at Simplenova with overall over 5 years of experience with Dynamics, NAV, and Business Central. Most of my experience comes from working with upgrades to BC on-prem and various cloud solutions. And these usually upgrades have various challenges on their own. Quite a lot of them have some features that have to be reworked to when we want to move to cloud. And it definitely does feel rewarding when things do get done and you do have things that work the way they intend to as a cloud solution. So today we'll delve into the topic of the new SharePoint connector by Microsoft. which is now included into the Business Central's system application. But beforehand, we'll have to have a short overview of the system application itself and what exactly is different now in versions BC 21 and later. The main topic, though, is somewhat related to the previous webinars, if any of you have attended, where we had to face the challenges of working with file directories and using Open Authorization 2.0 and along with Graph API to connect to SharePoint or OneDrive. The methods used to require us to build our own connector. So we'll have a look at what can be done with the connector that Microsoft has provided in the system application, and we'll try utilizing some of its features to achieve some of the planned results. So after that, we'll go on by setting up the Azure application, connecting to a SharePoint site and trying out a few features. So let's begin, first of all, with the system application. So as of BC21, the system application has become an app which stores a number of different Business Central features, which we can utilize to achieve whatever we want it is that we want to achieve. And these features are all built into separate different modules that are neatly stored in the system application. So the source code of these applications is available on Microsoft GitHub, and Microsoft tries to adapt the Microsoft's open source code of conduct and the system application is somewhat is open source, and they accept various change and pull requests from the community so that we as developers can also partake in the expansion and development of the product. So if there's anything that anyone wants to do with the system application or maybe some sort of a special module and such, everyone has the opportunity to partake in the expansion and development of certain modules, and they can easily push their changes, and they might be accepted by Microsoft later in the future and will be available for everyone else as well. So what does the system application actually continue other than Marius, the SharePoint connector and such? Well, the system application has a lot of modules, and each module contains some documentation and perhaps with various code examples so that you can attempt to try out the functionality and perhaps even integrate it within your solution. So what is exactly is in there at the moment? Well, a few things, for example, barcode encoders, camera media interaction, various .NET alliances. Some of the listed modules may be familiar to you and perhaps have already been touched upon and explored at some time before. Those who have been working on moving their solution to cloud might have found cloud-compatible .NET code units that can help them refactor the .NET library usage. So in the end, the full list is available on GitHub along with documentation and some examples. So for example, if I would open up my browser here and you can search on various search engines, or just go to the URL directly to Microsoft AL app extensions. You can then find the system app right here, and you can find all of these the source code of all the little modules, and among them you should find the SharePoint authorization and SharePoint. Now we'll delve into the differences between these two later on, but just know that you may see the source code and some examples of these modules when accessing the module itself and looking at the README file. And the examples are quite self-explanatory and then can provide some help when trying to use them. So anyway, let's not spend too much time here. Let's move on to the SharePoint connector. And as far as I know, it's similar to the ones that were built upon the Open Authorization 2 and Graph API. So you'll see some similarities when it comes to setting up the SharePoint authorization. So first things first, just like in some other connectors, the information we need to set up the Azure application are a few of the parameters that we get when setting up the Azure app. So the information we need from the Azure application, which acts almost as a gateway to our SharePoint site, is the app's client ID, and which is generated when registering an application in the portal. Next is the client secret, which is the password that is also generated in the portal and can be copied while the page is open. And lastly, the SharePoint site's URL, which to which we want to connect to. And the URL is simply the URL you can copy from your browser. So let's not also forget to give the API permissions to access the SharePoint sites and drives. So let's just have a look at how things were set up in our current application. So if I would access my Azure portal, I would have to go to app registrations. And here you can click on new registration. I already have my app registered right here. Is the same app that I used for various OneDrive and SharePoint connectors as well, because of how similar this setup usually is. So when you create a new application, when you want to register a new app, really what you want to do is just set up a few things. So first of all, what we have is the client ID, which we can copy now to our notepad or somewhere else where we want to store it. The next thing we want to do is go to authentication. And if we were to create a new application, we would also be given this this page to fill in. But what we want to do is just simply add in the redirect URI, which is by default usually Business Central Dynamics / sometimes it can even contain your tenant ID, and just add /auth landing.htm. If you're on-prem, usually your on-prem's URL would work fine as well. Just add the OAuth landing HTML at the end. The next thing we want to do is set up the client secret. To set up a secret, simply access certificates and secrets. Just go to new client secret and type in the description that you desire and your expiration date. I already have a secret set up right here. Whenever you create a new secret, the value is visible, and I suggest you copy the value before it becomes hidden whenever you refresh the page or change the menu and such. And the last thing we want to do is let's go to API permissions and set up the permissions for the API. Now, according to Microsoft's documentation, the only permission that you need for the SharePoint module, I believe, is sites read write all, and it should be a delegated permission. So for example, we would want to click on add permission, select Microsoft Graph, and then delegated permissions. And then we would have to find the permission that we want to find. Now, here I have basically a lot of permissions, and you can play around as well, but usually site permissions are more than enough to allow access to SharePoint from Business Central. So now that we have set up our app in the Azure portal, all we have to do is just make sure we save all the information we got from the app. So it's the client ID, the secret, and of course the SharePoint URL, which we can find by simply accessing our SharePoint site. So yeah, that is quite enough from the Azure setup perspective. What we need to do now is begin by utilizing the SharePoint connector and building our extension. So what exactly do we have to do to connect to a SharePoint site? So the information we collected from the portal, which is the client ID and the secret, would need to be stored somewhere, perhaps. And now, if you are practicing, you may just want to hard code these things into your code and for the time being and just move on. But in the long run, it's best to create a setup table to store the data and use it when authorizing to SharePoint. Now, when using the SharePoint module, we have two separate basically modules that are in the system application. One is the SharePoint authorization and the other is just SharePoint. Now, what is the difference between the two of those? The main difference is that SharePoint authorization doesn't store any data and it's really just used to authorize and connect to a site. As for SharePoint itself, it is used to interact with the site. So now, what exactly do we need to do to authorize? Now, as I mentioned, we copied all of the needed data to, let's just say, to Notepad, and now we would need to have some sort of a place to store all that data to authorize whenever we need access to SharePoint. So again, I mentioned you may want to hard code this in if you're playing around, but if you want to do something that's going to be more flexible and expandable, I suggest creating a table which can store the following fields, which is the ID, the secret, and the URL. And of course, the needed setup page for the setup as well. So it should contain those three fields as well, and maybe some code and some actions to authorize this to the SharePoint site. So let's move on to the demonstration a bit. So what I have here is my Visual Studio Code environment. So I have this table here created with the needed fields. So there's nothing else here that's really needed. And I have a setup page for it created as well, which contains a lot of code. But for the time being, what we have to pay attention to is these three fields that we added to the page. And I've also added another group below it. Now, this group will be further explained during the demonstrations, but really it will be used for some additional functionalities. Uh, Basically, I've created global variables that can store a file name, the contents of the file, and the directory of the file that we want to create and write to a SharePoint drive. And lastly, I've added a sub page here, which is basically a customly made table with a page. Really, I made this for the purposes of displaying a list of items that we can retrieve from a SharePoint site. So really, it's the record right here, which is basically a connector list. It's a list of items that we can retrieve from SharePoint. And I will be simply displaying the title, the description of an object, and the server relative URL and the OData URL of each file and folder. And I will be displaying it in this page here, which was added as a sub page. So what else we would need to pay attention to is that I've also added the delete all here on open page. Now the reason why is because I would like to clear the records from the table every time I open this page. So really this page was made as an example. So let's go on and see how exactly the setup looks like in our environment. So I have my Business Central sandbox here. Um, I'll open up my SharePoint connector setup, which is the custom setup page that I made. And what we have here is the client ID, the SharePoint URL, and the secret. Now, the SharePoint URL can simply be copied right here when you open up your SharePoint site that you wish to connect to. So I have this site here, SPLN2, which I use for testing. And I simply just copy the URL and paste it right here in the SharePoint URL field. Now, I'm connecting to a SharePoint site. I've made the action called connect to a site. Now, how exactly does the connection work? So if I go to my SharePoint connector setup and go to the code of the action here, you can see that we have quite a lot of lines, but a lot of these functions really are provided by Microsoft in their GitHub as an example. So the first thing we need when connecting to a site is the Active Directory tenant ID, which can be received from our URL. We also have HTTP diagnostics and a SharePoint list, which will be explained why we have them. So first things first, we get the Active Directory tenant ID from our URL by using the function get AAD tenant name from base URL. Now, this function is provided by Microsoft in their GitHub, and really what it does, it's basically a parser that's reformats the URL to be acceptable when trying to get an authorization token to access and authorize to SharePoint. So moving on, once we have the tenant ID, we can now begin by using SharePoint client. Now, SharePoint client is a global variable that I've established right here in this page, and it simply is the code unit called SharePoint client. This is basically the main code unit that we'll be using to perform various functions. So first function that we have to do is initialize the SharePoint client. And what we have to provide as parameters is the URL without even the formatting the URL, just a regular one. And we have to get the SharePoint authorization interface. And to do that, we have another function declared, and we use the AAD tenant ID parameter. So if I go to that function, it's a small procedure which really just declares a scope. The scope is really just default, but if you want to, you can also use offline access, just like previously, whenever you use the access tokens, or if anybody uses refresh tokens, offline access allows the user to only authorize once. So next, we'll just exit with the SharePoint auth, which is the code unit SharePoint authorization. And we'll exit with the create authorization code function. And the parameters needed for this function are all the ones that we gathered from our Azure setup, which is the Active Directory tenant ID, the client ID, the secret, and the scopes that we just declared. So now that we're able to initialize the client, the connection between Business Central and SharePoint should be done, and we should be able to perform anything we want with the SharePoint site. But also, if you want to, for debugging purposes and such, you can also use HTTP diagnostics to get the diagnostics of the connection and see if there's any errors and such. But to do that, you have to perform at least one action with the SharePoint client. So in our case, it's the get lists action. In short, the get lists function really just retrieves all of the lists that are within the SharePoint site. If I were to access my SharePoint, I can see home, documents, page, test library, and such. These are called lists, and we can retrieve them using this function. So once we perform that function, the diagnostics data is filled in the SharePoint client, and we can retrieve the diagnostics data and then display them in a message or use it for debugging purposes and such. So let's try this function out. I will open up my SharePoint connector setup. I'll just go to actions and connect to a site. And I'll get the message diagnostics 200, and it says okay. So 200 is the HTTP code for a successful connection, and okay really is just the reason for the status. It means that everything is okay. So this is the way you can connect to a SharePoint site. And now we can proceed further from here and move on to various other things we can do with the SharePoint client code unit. So another thing we can try doing is getting a file list from a SharePoint site. Now, speaking of a list in SharePoint, I've crafted this rough draft of a SharePoint module that somewhat that is somewhat modeled in Business Central. So really the SharePoint client, as I've mentioned before, is used as a general code unit for various actions. But to get any data on whatever it is that we want to access in our SharePoint site, we first have to get the lists, all the lists within the SharePoints with documents, libraries, galleries, and such. And once we're able to get the lists, we can then move on and, for example, access documents by getting folders from that SharePoint list. And from the folders, we can then move on to files. So the main records and objects that you will be using if you want to access folders and files and such is the SharePoint file, SharePoint folder, and SharePoint list. And of course, the SharePoint client code unit. So let's move on and see how exactly can we retrieve a list of various SharePoint items and such. So if I were to scroll down, and I have a function here called get list. Now it seems like a large function, but mainly it's done so for the purposes of this webinar. Really, to get a list of well, basically to get records of all the SharePoint lists, all we have to do is use this function get lists and add SharePoint lists as a parameter. We have them as temporary because they will be filled in here by this function. Once we do, we get the list of all the SharePoint basically lists. So home, documents, pages, test library, and all the data regarding these lists. Now, what I've done here is I've added a delete all function to the list that I have on my setup, which is the subpage, just to clear out any of the unneeded records so that we would have a clear slate to display all of the SharePoint lists. What else I did was I added a set range to filter out what list I want to access. So in this case, I'd like to access documents, and then I just find the first record. And once I do, I'm able to use use the data from this record to access a folder. So another function we can use is get document library root folder. And really what it does is basically just returns the document library root and all the files and such in the directory of the root. So basically to get the directory of the SharePoint root folder, we have to provide the OData ID of our list, which is one of the key fields that we're always going to use. Basically, it's like a unique identifier that we use as a parameter to access a folder and such. And of course, SharePoint folder, which is an empty temporary record. Once we do that, we can move on to get folder files by server relative URL. Now, this function lets you retrieve all the files within a folder, and all you need to do that is simply get the server relative URL for that and just be initialized in SharePoint. Now, all of this can ultimately become meaningless if you already have the server relative URL saved. This is what I meant by the connection to SharePoint being rather simple if you have any of the data saved in various fields and such. So in this case, in this scenario, what we're using is this scenario, basically we're trying to get the server relative URL of root folder, and we don't know it. So once we get the folder files, all of the file data is written here into the SharePoint file record. And now what I do is I use a find set function to reset the view, because apparently when you get to the SharePoint files, the pointer is on the last record, and if you use a repeat, it will end after a single loop. So what I did was just I added a find set to simply reset the view, and now we can continue on by initializing our custom records and just simply use it for display purposes to insert into that subpage. Now let's simply update the subpage. So let's see this code in action. I'll just simply go to actions and get SharePoint list, and it updates with 3 files. Now, if I were to access my SharePoint documents, this is the list that I've filtered out. I see that there's 3 files: book, test doc, and test file. And I see the same thing here with these files, and I have the server relative URL and the OData ID. Now, since we have the server relative URL, basically, we can now just use this URL to do whatever it is we want to do in shared documents folder, which is this folder right here that we have opened. So we'll have to use this in the future. But as of right now, we'll move on and see what else can be done with the SharePoint connector. So another thing we should try doing is perhaps uploading some sort of a file to a SharePoint site. Now, getting a list might be tricky and such, and specifically finding out some sort of a special web URL would be difficult maybe, but uploading a file to a SharePoint site seems to be rather simple. If I were to go to my action, which is the create file right here, remember that I have declared 3 fields here, which is file name, file contents, and file directory. So I'll be using the data from these fields to create a file within a SharePoint directory. So let's move on to our VS Code here. And what we have declared here is a temp blob, an in-stream and out-stream, and a SharePoint file. So what I did was simply create the temp blob, write the contents into a stream, and then get an in-stream to read the data from the temp blob, and just add it as a parameter to add file to folder. So this function here creates a file within some sort of a folder that you provide, which is here, file directory. And here's the name, and then the SharePoint file is returned with additional data, such as the relative web URL and the OData ID. So for example, if I were to create, for example, webinar file .txt and just type in the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, and I'll add the directory as /sites spln2 shared documents, which is the folder right here. All I can do now is I can create a file. No, nothing seemed to have happened because I have no messages added or user interface pop-ups. But if I go to my SharePoint right now and refresh the page or just wait for it, it refreshes and creates a file right here, webinar file. And if I open it up, it says a quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. So that is a simple method of how we can use the SharePoint module to create files within our SharePoint drive. So last and not least, there are some other methods of manipulating files and using the SharePoint module, which I'm about to discuss. So I'll demonstrate again a few other functions. One of these functions would be show directory. Now, what I've made is a method of displaying and receiving all folders and files within the server relative URL that we input right here in the file directory. So for example, if I were to input the shared documents right here to root folder, and if I wanted to display all folders and files, I would simply, what I have to do is just use these two functions right here. One is get subfolders by server relative URL, and the other is get folder files by server relative URL. So both of them contain the same parameter, file directory, just both have the different parameters to return all the data, which is the SharePoint folder and SharePoint file. The rest of the code really has nothing to do with the SharePoint connector. It's really just for me to display the data in the subpage. So ultimately, these few lines are all you need to get the data you need from a SharePoint site. So let's see how the function works. So what I do is I simply click on show directory, and it updates with all of the files that are here in this SharePoint directory. And for example, if I wanted to look into something else, for example, I go to customers and maybe new store and sales, for example, all I have to do is just type in customers, new store, sales, and if I click on show directory, it should update with the test.txt, and it should also provide the server relative URL. So the URL really works in a similar fashion like a Windows URLs would work as well when it comes to using file management. So that might give everyone who's working on upgrades and such a chance to rework the file management in a more comfortable way. And lastly, we can also download the file. And file downloads really are as simple as file uploads, maybe even simpler. I have a function here written download file. And really what I did was I just get the record that I selected in the subpage and just get the needed data. And the data that I need to download the file is the OData ID and maybe even a title. But regardless, we can always hard code something in if we want to. But for now, we collected the title and the OData ID. And now if I, for example, go back to my shared documents here and just show directory, I just want to see all the files. And for example, I want to download test file.txt right here. I would go to my actions and download selected file. And the test file downloads. And if I display if I look into the file, I have the contents of the file. So if I go back here to customers and I open up the file, you can see that it's pretty much the exact same file. So ultimately, utilizing the SharePoint module is rather simple. What makes it complex is attempting to replicate the old file management systems that we used in previous NEV versions, such as folder browsing, open file dialog, save file dialog, and things like that. But accessing some sort of a saved directory and reading the contents of the file would prove relatively easily with this SharePoint module. So the only thing I would like to point out, though, is that this module is still rather limited. What I personally found it lacking in is some additional features such as moving or renaming files or even deleting files. I don't know if it will be possible in the future. This is something that would be great to address and ask Microsoft on. But if possible, then it's possible for any of us in the community to expand this module and make these features come true. So that is it for my current webinar. Thank you all for attending, and I think it'll be time for some questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Simonas. So also, I would like to, before starting the Q&A, I would like to remind that you will receive the recording of the webinar within upcoming days or within next week. So if you'll need some additional, if you'll forget something or and so on, you'll be able to see it later on. Also, Don't forget that you are able to test the tool that I presented in the very beginning of the session, Simplenova's AL tool. So contact Simplenova through the website or contact us via sales@simplenova.com directly, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And I believe right now, Simonas, we can start with the first questions.
Yeah, so the first question was, what would be the authentication when using this with on-prem BC? So I'm not sure about the answer, what the authentication would be. Personally, I think it would be the same as it is on the cloud. So to answer your question, it would work the same way on-prem just as in cloud, and I think it's based on open authorization too as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but if it do, then I'm glad I have to help. Another similar question was when am I authenticating on behalf of a user, or is it service to service? So I believe it is service to service, mainly because when initializing and authenticating, I believe it takes the current tenant or the current user. So it might be user, but I'll have to get back to you on that. This is something that might even be explained in the SharePoint's authorization GitHub's README file. So yeah.
Okay, so we still have time for new questions. At the same time, let's say getting back to the same thing for the upgrades. If you are preparing to do the upgrade, Simplenova could help you with the upgrade evaluation analysis. So you could prepare before the upgrades, because we can prepare you the analysis regarding the parts which cannot be upgraded properly as is and might require factoring and so on. So with this analysis, you could simply be prepared more prior the upgrade. Yeah. So if you would like to test this part, once again, you can leave an inquiry on the website of ours. And I see, Simonas, that there are some more
Yeah,
questions.
so another question is, can I add metadata to a list item? Depends on what exactly you mean by that. If you mean by extending the SharePoint folder or file tables, I don't think that would be possible. I would get back to you on that later on, but right now I think adding metadata isn't really possible with this SharePoint module at the moment. But I'll see if I'm right or wrong at the moment, because right now I haven't seen anything about that written in Microsoft's documentation. And another question is, can a file placed in a SharePoint folder be shared with other users in Business Central? Yes, it can. Depending on how you'd like to share it, SharePoint, just like the name suggests, you can share this file with any other user, and depends on how you like to access it. If, for example, if you'd want to access the same SharePoint site from different cloud tenants, I believe that would be possible. Just you need to set up the Azure applications to allow both tenants to connect. But generally speaking, the SharePoint files should be accessible to many users from different solutions. And of course, there's a comment here in one of the questions answers. So thanks, Krzysztof. So apparently you cannot add metadata, but the pull request is underway to add metadata. So yeah, it is not Microsoft that develops the module, but it was developed by a partner and given as open source. So that is good to hear that many of the people from the community are working on it. So yeah, if there's any other questions, if there's not any, we'll then be able to wrap up this.
Let's have a couple of moments, let's say minute or two.
Another question is, can you plan a session OneDrive as well in the future? We'll see about that if we're able to. Right now, this module seems to be SharePoint focused only, but we'll see. I think Microsoft has something else for OneDrive and made. We'll see if it's something that will be important to use.
It seems, Simonas, maybe we can have one thing like to ask for some topics from the attendees that they would like to hear. Maybe that would give us, also a good thoughts what kind of webinar should be next.
Yeah, that would be true.
So guys, shout out as well.
Yeah.
What kind of topic you would like to hear later on?
Yeah, so apparently OneDrive is one of the topics right now. And one of the attendees mentioned that SharePoint is obsoleted and they want to use and go ahead with OneDrive. And that is something that I've noticed in the standard Microsoft SharePoint connectors. I've noticed that there's a page basically that allows you to set up a connector in a similar fashion that I did here in the example. Except it's obsoleted and we're recommended to use the OneDrive. So this is something that might have to be a topic in the future, and it'd be great to see what can be done. And another suggested topic would be the monetization of app source apps. I don't know if this is something that we'll present, but we'll see if this can be done. Again, ideas are great. So thank you. Okay, so there's another question. When do you recommend uploading files to SharePoint instead of uploading them as an attachment to Business Central documents? Could this save a lot of space in Business Central database? Depends, really. If you are using any, for example, blob storages or storing things as blobs, this could help you save some storage. For example, if you were to, instead of storing as blobs, you would send them to be stored to your SharePoint drive and such. If you're using an on-prem solution, this is a whole different scenario then, because then if you're storing physical files, documents, XML files and such in your server, this could help you save space if you're storing them in a SharePoint site. So to get back to the first question, when do I recommend you uploading files to SharePoint? Whenever you're using a cloud solution, basically, and if you're working on upgrades and you have some sort of solution that saves files somewhere physically, then this is a scenario where using a OneDrive or SharePoint could help you out. If not, then there's other scenarios, such as, for example, if you want to save physical file, images or documents and such that perhaps would rather be stored in a drive. And especially if you want to share this file with someone else in the same company and such, if you want to store it not in the Business Central environment, or for example, some sort of reports that maybe would need to be accessed multiple times. From a technical perspective, it's best to share a file in a drive when you know that it will be accessed multiple times. So there's many scenarios. I hope that answers your question. So another question was, are there any size limitations in SharePoint? OneDrive has limitation of 5 gigabytes per user, I guess. So this really depends. I don't exactly know the right numbers. There's always size limitations, but as far as I know, OneDrive, for example, allows you to increase the limits based on the subscription fee, as far as I know. So I think something similar is can be applied to SharePoint. So I cannot really answer this question at the moment, but I can get back to you with the actual numbers later on.
Okay, so if we don't have any additional questions, I believe we can complete today's session. But of course, if some questions will pop up later on, well, so I see there are some questions. Go on,
Yeah,
Simonas.
yeah, so there's a question, can there be a comparison video to choose SharePoint or OneDrive or blob storage based on size? That's another idea for maybe another topic, or maybe even a guideline or an article. That's something we'll keep in mind. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
I think it would be great if there isn't any, for example, comparisons done to see what works best.
okay, so while we are waiting for some additional questions, if they will appear, just to remind you that if something will pop up later on, don't hesitate to contact us via sales@simplenova.com. We'll see if we can, we'll do all our best to help you. And as I've mentioned earlier, if you would like to get more information regarding Salt or test it internally, just leave an inquiry on our website or contact us directly via sales@simplenova.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And as we don't have any additional questions, I believe, Simonas, we can finish the session today.
Yep.
It's time then to prepare for a new one, most probably within the second quarter of this year, April, May, something like that. So for sure, we'll keep you informed. And as for now, thank you very much for joining, for spending time with us, and take care.
Goodbye, everyone. Stay informed.